words that simply say, you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe.
My parents did a lot of things right. They taught me good values of self-reliance, of equality. They loved me. I never doubted that. They listened to my stories. They laughed at my jokes. But by the time I was about 12 years old, my parents drank to drunkenness every night, and they did so for 15 years. On Saturdays, it was beer by 10 o'clock, bourbon by 5, and wine until they went to bed. So my adolescence was filled with a lot of moldy food, a lot of stumbling around my stumbling parents at home, and a lot of loneliness. And what I said for many years was that my parents abandoned me. They abandoned us, my siblings and I, during our adolescence. But over time, I learned to say that they were wounded people who needed healing just like I do. All right, there's my parents, Glenn and Jane, on a good day. So I went from saying that they had abandoned me to saying they were wounded people like me who need healing. And until I reframed, I really don't think I was able to have a good relationship with my dad. So here's my dad and I would say the best years of our relationship were from his 85 to his 95. So I always tell my students there's hope for your relationship with your parents. Reframing changed my life. I learned that I had to speak these words. I had to articulate them in order to live into them. And yes, it is the subject of my book. This is an embedded advertisement. And I learned that we're not supposed to just walk the talk, we need to talk the talk. Wait, we're not supposed to just walk the walk, we need to talk the talk. That's not how we usually hear it or how we usually think about it. It's like this line from Augustine, who said, I am saddened that my tongue cannot live up to my heart. We hear it the other way, but both are true. We are all framers of the world. We're not just recorders of life the way it is. Out of all of the words that we might have chosen to explain an experience, we have chosen these to frame our experience, and it makes a difference. It's like Lyle here. We frame the world and we live inside the frame, and Lyle says, I made it myself. Yes, he did, and so do you, and so do I. So when you frame the world, what's in the picture? What are your word habits, your word disciplines? Is life cruel? Is it spiritually dynamic? Did Kristen ruin your life? Did John rescue you? How do you talk about it? Words create a sense of order for us. They give us meaning. Now, our bodies have a sense of order. It's called proprioception. So, physical proprioception is our sixth sense. It's how you know where your left ankle is right now. You don't really feel your left ankle, but you know where it is. And according to Oliver Sacks, physical proprioception provides the organic mooring of our identity. Just think how off-kilter we are when our bodies are off. Well, our mind has a sense of order too, and it gets this from language. I call it rhetorical proprioception. It's the linguistic mooring of our identity. Words help us to find our place in the world. But this sense of order isn't stable. Any more than our physical proprioception is. So as we age, as we get a disease, as we get healed from a disease, our physical proprioception changes. And our language changes all the time also. We are constantly reframing. And I think we reframe for mainly two reasons. We reframe, first of all, because of circumstances. Something happens in our lives. We have an accident. We get promoted. We have a divorce. We get married. Something happens. And for me, one of those things is that my mom got cirrhosis. Why did my parents drink for 15 years and then stop drinking? Well, my mom got cirrhosis, and she slowly died for 8 years, and she died during my first week of class as a professor here at Westmont. Well, I'd always thought that, hey, if I followed God, my life should be easier. And that was my frame. So I had to reframe because of circumstances that happened, and I'm sure you can think of reframing stories yourself. But we're also called to reframe. We could look at the gospel through this lens of reframing and say that Jesus often asks us to think of the world, to talk about the world like that, not like this. And we're constantly reframing. So it's not religious ceremony that matters so much as faith. It's not the first that we're guaranteed. We may be the last. It's not protecting yourself. It may be denying ourselves. It's not wealth that matters. It's love. Reframing is important to us, and it's especially important in what I call our 4 soul essentials. So let's just think about this briefly. There's remembering the past with gratitude. There's anticipating the future with hope. There's dwelling within ourselves in peace, and there's engaging with others in love. And I want you to see that I cleverly put this into a frame. This is really where we live. It's the intersection of time and space, past, future, inner, outer. This is who we are, where we live, and it makes sense that how we frame each of these areas of our lives would make a difference. So what I want to do in my very brief time here is introduce a little bit about one soul essential, remembering the past with gratitude. So when you frame your past, what's in the picture? You're not just recording the past as it was. You are choosing out of all the ways to talk about your past to talk about it in a particular way. And why do you frame it as you do? I'd like the past not to control me. I'd like to think of the past as a teacher for which I am grateful. But to reframe the past well, we need to be aware of some of the ways that our culture asks us to frame remembering and forgetting, and to maybe pose against those cultural frames some countercultural frames from Jesus. Remembering well requires discernment. So let's look at some different frames. So first of all, a cultural frame for remembering. Compulsive comparison. Our world, especially the world of social media, often leads us to a kind of envy-inspiring remembrance. I hope your life is half as perfect as you pretend it is. Our culture tells us to construct the good life on Facebook, on Instagram, as beautiful, beautiful friends, beautiful travels, beautiful food, beautiful selves. We are to frame our lives such that we communicate, I am enviable. And though our staged memory looks attractive, we know better. We know better because we're constantly comparing ourselves to all the other posts out there, and we know that we don't measure up to those. But we also know our own stories. our own stories of failure and regret. And we're so anxious about this that what we do is send out another post and another post, another post, and then hope somehow through this compulsive comparison that we can get ahead. A countercultural frame for remembering is redemptive review. To frame the past well, we walk through the truth about our lives, not just as positive postables, but also the tragic truths. I'm on a road with my memories. I'm winding up and down all around. There's grand vistas and there's tough slogging. And when I'm down, when I'm depressed, I hope to walk through my memory like the psalmist does, remembering what God has done for me. In Psalm 42, my soul is downcast within me, therefore I will remember you from the land of the Jordan. When I see my past in light of God's work, I can review it redemptively. We can look at a cultural frame of forgetting, intentional ignorance. I think this is the orientation of a lot of us in our times. We work so hard not to know. We just look at the websites that agree with us. It's the age of fake news, or at least the argument that there is lots of fake news. It's the age of climate change deniers, of reckless revisionists, Holocaust deniers. We're told, just forget about the truth. Just agree with my opinion. So we work hard to be ignorant, but our culture also encourages intentional ignorance. It says, just forget about your problems. Drink, party now. Don't worry about it. And we can be personal revisionists, ignoring our own history wherever it is troubling. We can push our monsters under the bed and live in a fantasy. There's a countercultural frame for forgetting. Focused forgiveness. We can practice Spirit-led remembering, and we can practice Spirit-led forgetting. A forgiveness that frames us toward the future. As Paul says, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. When we frame the past well, we can move from victim to survivor to healed one to heavenly being. And when I frame the past, when I reframe my past, I don't change the past. I change my present. I change my future. Years ago, I was at Young Life Camp in British Columbia. Oh, I forgot about Lewis Smedes. Sorry, Lewis. Let's read you. Lewis Smedes says, forgiveness has begun when you recall those who hurt you and feel the power to wish you well. That's a forgiveness that is moving beyond bitterness and forgetting the bitterness. So anyway, I was at this camp in Malibu, British Columbia, Young Life Camp, years ago, and I was one of 5 seminar speakers, and we were in a small group together. 2 of these people were working on an illustrated book from a child's point of view about alcoholism. One was the writer, and one was the illustrator. But neither of them had any experience with alcoholism, so they asked us. And one other adult guest, a woman, she had been physically abused by her father, who was an alcoholic. And another guest, the physician, he had become a physician because his mother was an alcoholic, and he wanted to work in a care unit, in a recovery unit. And then there was me. This experience at this camp with these people was one of the greatest moments of God's providence that I've ever experienced. So I was encouraged to tell my story, and as I did, I was tempted by the cultural frame of compulsive comparison. I said, why me? Why do I have to suffer? Why don't I have better memories like Jack does or like Karen does? Why do I have my memories? But as I talked, I saw how important it was to share my experiences with these people who understood. I shared about my mother's smell, which I can recall so easily. I talked about how I wandered night after night after night because I didn't want to go home. In the company of these empathetic disciples, it was a redemptive review. But the physician there, he noticed that I framed my life as if I hadn't been affected by this, as if I'd just moved on. I mean, I thought, hey, I'd come to Jesus, hadn't I? I should be a new person. But he helped me see that I was practicing a kind of intentional ignorance because actually I was a classic child of an alcoholic, attempting to control everything in my life. He named me, and I reframed myself in light of that. So to go forward, to live with forgiveness without bitterness, I had to focus my forgiveness, to see the alcoholism as monstrous, but not my parents as monsters. They were ordinary people who were doing their best to cope with the stresses of work, marriage, and children. My dad had seen terrible things in World War II. My mom had delivered a stillborn child. Neither of them had a clue how to have intimate conversation or to resolve conflict. These circumstances did not excuse their bad behavior. They did abandon me. But I have my bad behavior too. I have abandoned people as I've moved from one friend group to another. And I view my behavior through the lens of God's grace. Couldn't I do that with them also? We all have our reframing stories, and we all have more reframing to do. The gospel calls us to reframe well, which isn't necessarily the same thing as framing happily. And for some time, I've noticed that my spiritual development depends on it, because faith work is framework. So I want to close my time with a poem that I've written about the first time I experienced that my dad was drunk. We were driving home to a campsite from gambling, well, my parents were gambling in Lake Tahoe. It's called The Beginning of the Road of Ice. Remember that time, I'll show it to you here, it'll be easier. Remember the time when first we knew, on that sloppy, wide-eyed ride, the three of us kids in the back seat, no seat belts to keep us tight and safe. We grabbed the front seat, remember? Leaning in, leaning hard, we held on as Dad jerked the car this way and that around one blind turn and then blinder still on that snake night road. Why are you driving so fast? We screamed. We can go faster in the dark, he said, because the other guys can see our headlights coming. But the thing is, we didn't see it coming. This drive, this beginning of the road of ice and bourbon, and night after night of near misses and hits. Now we know. But remember this too. We didn't crash that night. Though we've had our accidents, our mangled frames and bodywork, we made it home. That's what we did. We made it home.